The heavy iron door slammed shut, with a sound that echoed through Abigail Monroe's bones. The key turned in the lock with terrible finality as Sheriff Wade Jenkins stepped back, his face a mask of indifference beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. Outside the barred window, the small town of Redemption Creek continued about its business, citizens averting their eyes from the jailhouse as they passed. 3 days, the sheriff said flatly. Judge Hamilton arrives on Wednesday. Until then, you can reflect on your sins. Abigail's parched lips parted. My children, the Wilcox family has them. Whether they stay there depends on the judge's ruling. Jenkins adjusted his hat, avoiding her gaze. Don't expect any special treatment, Mrs. Monroe. This town's made its decision about you. As his boots clacked across the wooden floor and the outer door shut behind him, Abigail sank onto the thin, straw-filled mattress, one hand pressed against her aching ribs where Hank Wilcox's men had struck her during the arrest. The other hand instinctively moved to her stomach, still slightly rounded from giving birth just 6 weeks earlier. 3 days, no food, no water. The message was clear. Redemption Creek had sentenced her to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abigail Monroe stared through the iron bars of the Redemption Creek jailhouse window, watching dust devils dance down the main street. The July heat pressed against the small frontier town like a physical weight, the air inside her cell so thick it seemed to resist her shallow breathing. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, soaking the back of her faded blue dress, once her Sunday best, now the only clothing she owned that wasn't stained with milk or spit up from baby Thomas. Thomas. Her heart constricted at the thought of her 6-week-old son. And Mary, barely 4 years old, with copper hair and a gap-toothed smile that had once been the mirror image of her father's. What would Hank Wilcox's wife tell them about why their mother had disappeared? The truth, or the lies that had spread? Through Redemption Creek like poison? 24 hours had passed since Sheriff Jenkins had locked her in this cell and walked away, taking the water bucket with him. Her tongue felt swollen, her lips cracked and bleeding. This wasn't an arrest. It was an execution without the dignity of a hanging. 6 months ago, she was respected in this town. Abigail Wright Monroe, schoolteacher turned wife of Lieutenant James Monroe, who'd ridden off with the 7th Cavalry and returned in a pine box with nothing but his pocket watch and wedding band. The town had mourned with her then, bringing food and offering condolences, the women taking turns helping with 4-year-old Mary while Abigail's pregnancy advanced. Everything changed when Abigail started asking questions, the dry goods store's ledger that didn't match what the army had paid. For supplies, the cattle that disappeared from Widow Jensen's ranch the night after she refused to sell to Hank Wilcox. The way Mayor Fletcher's pockets seemed to bulge with gold, while the town's promised schoolhouse remained unbuilt. You're just grieving, Mrs. Monroe, they'd told her at first, patting her hand with false sympathy. Pregnancy makes women emotional. You shouldn't worry about business matters. But Abigail had been the one to balance the regiment's books when James was alive. Numbers didn't lie, even when people did. She'd written letters to the territorial governor, to the army quartermaster, even to a newspaper editor in Chicago who'd once printed a story about James's heroism. When she'd caught Wilcox's son tampering with her outgoing mail, she'd hidden her next letter in Mary's rag doll and paid the baker's boy to post it from the next town over. That letter had finally brought a U.S. Marshal to Redemption Creek. The day after he'd started asking questions, they found him face down in Walker's Creek with a bullet in his back. The day after that, Sheriff Jenkins and 3 deputies had dragged Abigail from her small cabin on the edge of town. Abigail Monroe, you're under arrest for the murder of U.S. Marshal Daniel Cooper. She'd laughed at first, thinking it a cruel joke. But the bruises on her arms from their grip were real enough, as was the throbbing pain in her ribs where Wilcox's foreman had struck her when she'd tried to reach for Mary. She'd heard her daughter's screams as Martha Wilcox had gathered both children into her wagon, Thomas wailing in hunger, torn from his mother's breast mid-feeding. A sound pulled Abigail from her bitter memories, boot steps on the boardwalk outside. Not Jenkins' familiar tread, but lighter, purposeful. The jailhouse door opened, then closed quietly. "Sheriff?" a woman's voice called. Abigail recognized it instantly, Rebecca Holloway, the midwife who'd delivered both Mary and Thomas. Silence answered her call. Jenkins was likely at Wilcox's saloon, where he spent most afternoons. The inner door creaked open, and Rebecca appeared, her round face pale beneath her bonnet. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before approaching the cell. "Oh, Abigail," she whispered, eyes widening at the sight of the prisoner. "What have they done to you?" "My children." Abigail's voice cracked. "Mary's refusing to eat," Rebecca said quickly, pulling a small canteen from beneath her shawl and passing it through the bars. "Martha Wilcox sent for me when the girl wouldn't stop crying. Thomas is taking goat's milk, but it doesn't sit well with him. He's colicky." Abigail unscrewed the canteen with shaking hands and took a careful sip, the lukewarm water like heaven on her parched tongue. "Small sips," Rebecca cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." "They're saying I killed the marshal," Abigail said after a moment, keeping her voice low. Rebecca's eyes darted to the door again. "Everyone knows that's not true, but Wilcox and the mayor are too scared to speak up." She pulled a small bundle. From her pocket, jerky and a heel of bread. "I can't stay long. Jenkins checks the jail every few hours." "Why are you helping me?" Abigail asked, accepting the food with trembling fingers. "They'll turn on you, too." "My Henry worked for James before he joined the cavalry," Rebecca said simply. "He always said your husband was the only honest officer he'd ever known." Her expression hardened. "And I've delivered too many babies in this town not to know who's capable of murder and who isn't." A floorboard creaked outside. Rebecca stiffened. "I have to go. I'll try to check on your children again tomorrow." "Rebecca," Abigail caught her hand through the bars. "If I don't survive this, don't talk that way." "If I don't," Abigail insisted, "tell my children the truth when they're old enough. Tell them their mother fought for justice, not just for their father, but for everyone Wilcox and his cronies have wronged." Rebecca squeezed her hand, tears welling. "You'll tell them yourself." She pulled away, heading for the door. "I've heard rumors," she whispered, pausing. "A rider came through last night asking questions at the Broken Wheel Inn. Someone from outside. Maybe—" She shook her head. "Just hold on, Abigail." After Rebecca left, Abigail broke the jerky into small pieces, as the midwife had instructed, eating slowly to avoid cramping. The bread she saved, wrapping it carefully in her handkerchief and tucking it beneath the thin mattress. As she rationed the precious water, sipping sparingly even as her body craved more, Abigail tried to make sense of Rebecca's parting words. A rider asking questions, an outsider. Was it possible someone had received one of her letters after all? Hope was dangerous in her situation, almost as dangerous as the truth she carried. The truth. Abigail closed her eyes, leaning her head against the cool stone wall. She hadn't witnessed Marshal Cooper's murder, but she knew who had. The night before his body was found, she'd been gathering late blackberries along Walker's Creek, Thomas strapped to her chest, when voices had drawn her into the shelter of a lightning struck. Oak Mayor Fletcher and Hank Wilcox stood on the bank, facing the marshal. The setting sun had painted their faces in shades of blood and gold. "You've got nothing but the hysterical claims of a war widow," Fletcher had said, his normally jovial voice hard-edged. "No judge will take her word over ours." "I've got more." "Than her word," Cooper had replied, his hand resting casually near his holster. "I've got copies of the quartermaster's records, witness statements from Fort Laramie, and a very interesting telegram from Chicago about missing army funds. Wilcox had stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the dying sunlight. "Do you know how many lawmen have disappeared in these territories, Marshal? Indians, outlaws, accidents. No one would question it. Are you threatening a federal officer, Mr. Wilcox?" Abigail had clutched Thomas tighter, hardly daring to breathe. The baby had stirred against her chest, and she'd backed deeper into the shadows, moving carefully downstream until she could cross and circle back to town by another route. The next morning, Cooper's body had been discovered by a trapper, face down in the shallow water where she'd seen the three men talking. She'd known then that she was next. But she'd underestimated their cunning. Why risk killing her outright when they could let the law do it for them? A convenient arrest, a locked cell, no food or water. By the time the circuit judge arrived, there would be nothing left but to rule her death. A tragic case of jail fever. The sound of horses outside pulled Abigail from her dark thoughts. Multiple riders moving at speed. The jailhouse door banged open, and Sheriff Jenkins stormed in, followed by Hank Wilcox himself, his grey suit immaculate despite the heat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Who's been here?" Jenkins demanded, unlocking the cell door and grabbing Abigail roughly by the arm. "Who brought you this?" He kicked the canteen, spilling its precious contents across the dirt floor. "No one," Abigail said, wincing as his fingers dug into the existing bruises. Wilcox loomed in the doorway, his silver hair gleaming in the shaft of late afternoon sunlight from the small window. At 55, he still moved with the coiled strength that had made him rich, first as a bounty hunter, then as a cattle baron, and finally as the power behind Redemption Creek's rapid growth. "Holloway's wife was seen coming from this direction," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "Perhaps we need to have a conversation with the good midwife about interfering in legal matters." "Leave Rebecca alone," Abigail said, yanking her arm from Jenkins' grasp. "She was checking if Mary's fever had spread to me. You wouldn't want an epidemic in your town, would you, Mr. Wilcox?" It was a calculated risk, mentioning illness. If they thought she might be carrying something contagious, they might keep their distance, but if they believed Mary was truly sick, they might use it against her. "Your daughter is perfectly healthy," Wilcox said, a thin smile breaking through his bushy mustache. "My Martha has quite taken to the child, says she has a natural talent for needlework. As for the baby, well, a growing boy needs a father's guidance, doesn't he?" The implication struck Abigail like a physical blow. Wilcox had 8 sons already, grown men who managed his various enterprises across the territory. His youngest was 17. Why would he want? The realization dawned with sickening clarity. Thomas would inherit James's military pension and land grant once the paperwork cleared. Not a fortune, but a tidy sum for an infant with no father to claim it. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "People know what you're doing." "People know what we tell them to know," Wilcox countered. "By this time next week, they'll remember how the grieving widow lost her mind after her husband's death, how she murdered a U.S. Marshal who came to help her, how, overcome with remorse, she took her own life in this very cell." He glanced around the bare room. Hanged herself with strips of her dress, perhaps. Very tragic, very final. Jenkins looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Wilcox, we agreed to protect this town's interests." Wilcox cut him off. "Nothing has changed." He turned back to Abigail. "Enjoy your solitude, Mrs. Monroe. I hear the nights get quite cold here, even in summer." After they left, Abigail sank down on the mattress, mind racing. Wilcox's visit confirmed what she'd suspected. They never intended for her to face the judge. Whatever was coming would happen soon, within the next day or two. As the light faded from the small window, Abigail found herself thinking of her husband. James had been the opposite of men like Wilcox, quiet where they were loud, thoughtful, where they were impulsive, guided by principles rather than greed. He loved the law, believed in justice. The frontier isn't lawless because it lacks laws, he'd once told her. It's lawless because men pick and choose which laws apply to them. The last letter she'd received from him before his death had contained a $1 and a promise. Keep this safe. If trouble ever finds you and I'm not there, take it to Jacob Greyhorse at Fort Defiance. He'll know what it means. But Fort Defiance was 100 miles away, and Jacob Greyhorse, whoever he was, wouldn't learn of her plight in time to help her or her children. As full darkness descended, Abigail curled onto her side, preserving what little strength remained. Sleep came in restless bursts, punctuated by the distant howl of coyotes and the occasional shout from the saloon down the street. Sometime in the deepest part of night, Abigail jerked awake, every sense suddenly alert. Something had changed. The quality of silence, perhaps, or a shift in the air. The jail was dark, but not as dark as it should have been. A faint glow spilled beneath the outer door, not lamplight, but the cooler radiance of the moon. Abigail sat up slowly, straining. To hear no footsteps, no breathing, and yet she knew with absolute certainty that she was no longer alone. The outer door opened without a sound, which should have been impossible given its perpetual creak. A shadow moved across the patch of moonlight. On the floor, tall and straight-backed, not Jenkins' slouched silhouette or Wilcox's broad frame. The inner door opened next, and Abigail pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. The figure paused in the doorway, face obscured by shadow, then moved forward with liquid grace that reminded her of a hunting cat. As the visitor approached the cell, moonlight caught the gleam of a silver star pinned to a black leather vest. Not the tin badge Jenkins wore, but something older, more formal. Mrs. Monroe. The voice was deep, with the faintest hint of an accent she couldn't place. "My name is Nathaniel Rivers. I understand you've been looking for justice in redemption." Creak! He stepped closer, into a shaft of moonlight, and Abigail's breath caught. He was tall and lean, perhaps 35, with sharp cheekbones and copper skin that spoke of native heritage. His black hair was cut shorter than most Indian men wore theirs, but longer than a white man's, falling to his shoulders in straight lines. A thin scar ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth, pulling it into a slight, permanent grimace. Most striking were his eyes. One dark as midnight, the other a startling pale blue that seemed to glow in the darkness. "Who are you?" Abigail whispered. The man reached into his vest and withdrew something that caught the moonlight, a key. Not the iron key Jenkins carried, but a slender brass duplicate. "I'm the answer to your letters, Mrs. Monroe," he said, fitting the key into the lock. "And I believe you have information that will help me bring down the men who killed Marshal Cooper, the same men who've been stealing from the U.S. government for years." The lock turned with a soft click. "We don't have much time," Rivers continued, swinging the cell door open. "Can you walk?" Abigail rose on unsteady legs. "My children." "First things first," Rivers cut her off gently. "We need to get you somewhere safe. Then we'll discuss how to recover your children and expose the corruption in Redemption Creek." He offered his arm, and Abigail hesitated only briefly before taking it. As Rivers guided her toward the door, she noticed the Colt revolver holstered at his hip and the knife sheathed at his back, not the weapons of a common lawman. "Mr. Rivers," she asked as they paused at the outer door, "exactly who do you work for?" His mismatched eyes met hers, the blue ones seeming to look straight through to her soul. "I work for justice, Mrs. Monroe," he said simply. "Now, let's get you out of here before the good sheriff realizes his prisoner has flown." Moonlight silvered the alleyway behind the jailhouse as Nathaniel Rivers guided Abigail through the shadows. Her legs trembled beneath her, weak, from dehydration and confinement. Each step required deliberate concentration, her body feeling strangely disconnected after the shock of this unexpected rescue. "Stay close to the buildings," Rivers murmured, his hand steady at her elbow. "Jenkins pays 2 men to watch the jail from the saloon. If they're doing their job, they've already noticed something's wrong." As if summoned by his words, a shout rose from the direction of Main Street. A door slammed, followed by the sound of running boots. "Too late," Rivers said, his voice calm, despite the urgency of their situation. "Change of plans!" He led her to the back of the livery stable, where 2 horses waited, already saddled. One was a magnificent buckskin with a black mane, the other a sturdy dun mare. Rivers helped Abigail mount the mare, then swung effortlessly onto the buckskin. "Head for the creek," he instructed, pointing toward the dark line of cottonwoods that marked the watercourse east of town. "Stay in the water for half a mile, then follow the bank north. I'll be right behind you." "But I don't," Abigail began, then bit back her protest. This wasn't the time to admit she'd never ridden without James or her father accompanying her. The mare seemed gentle enough, and whatever uncertainty she had about horseback riding paled against the dangers of remaining in Redemption Creek. She nudged the horse forward, wincing as her body protested the unfamiliar posture. Behind her, Rivers remained stationary, watching the town. "Go," he urged when she hesitated. "I need to make sure no one follows." The mare picked her way carefully through the darkness, seeming to understand the need for stealth. Abigail clung to the saddle horn, her weakened state making balance difficult. The cool night air carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere in the distance a lone coyote called to the moon. When she reached the creek, Abigail guided the mare into the shallow water as instructed. The splash of hooves masked any sounds from town, but she strained to hear, wondering what Rivers was doing. A single gunshot echoed across the plains, followed by a second. Her heart lurched painfully. The mare continued steadily upstream, unbothered by the sounds. Abigail fought the urge to turn back, reminding herself that she knew nothing about this man except that he'd freed her from certain death. If he'd been killed helping her escape, returning would only ensure that his sacrifice was wasted. After what seemed an eternity, she reached what she judged to be the half-mile mark. The creek bank rose more steeply here, with a narrow game trail visible in the moonlight. Abigail guided the mare out of the water and onto the path heading north as Rivers had directed. She'd traveled perhaps another quarter-mile when hoofbeats approached from behind. Panicked, she urged the mare into a stand of juniper, heart pounding as she fumbled at her waist for a weapon she didn't possess. "Mrs. Munro." Rivers' voice came softly through the darkness. "It's safe." Relief flooded through her as his tall figure materialized out of the shadows, the buckskin moving with the same liquid grace as its rider. "I heard shots," she said as he drew alongside her, "a necessary distraction." There was no boastfulness in his tone, just pragmatic efficiency. "Jenkins and his deputies are currently convinced we're heading west toward Cottonwood Junction." "Where are we actually going?" "North to Blackwater Canyon. I have a camp there." He studied her face in the moonlight. "It's about 4 hours' ride. Can you manage?" The concern in his voice triggered an unexpected surge of determination. "I'll manage." Rivers nodded once, apparently satisfied. "We'll alternate between walking and trotting. The horses can't sustain a gallop over that distance, and the terrain gets rough." As they rode north, the prairie gradually gave way to more rugged landscape. Low, rocky hills rose on either side, dotted with pinyon pines and juniper. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file, Rivers leading the way with the confidence of someone who'd traveled this route many times before. Despite her brave words, the journey tested Abigail's endurance. The initial rush of escape had faded, leaving her acutely aware of her weakened condition. Her ribs ached with each breath, and dizziness threatened whenever they changed pace. Only the thought of her children kept her upright in the saddle. "We'll rest here," Rivers announced after about 2 hours, halting beside a small spring nestled among boulders. He dismounted in one fluid motion, then moved to help Abigail. Her legs buckled as they touched the ground, and he caught her easily, steadying her until she found her balance. "Drink slowly," he advised, leading her to the spring. "Too much at once will make you ill." The water tasted of minerals and earth, sweeter than any wine Abigail had ever sampled. She cupped her hands, forcing herself to sip rather than gulp, while Rivers tended to the horses. "You're a U.S. Marshal," she stated, rather than asked, having noticed the manner in which he cared for his equipment. Methodical and thorough, like James had been. "Was," Rivers corrected, unsaddling the buckskin. "Among other things." "What does that mean?" He paused, mismatched eyes reflecting starlight. "It means my jurisdiction is complicated." "Like your heritage?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider its boldness. To her surprise, a hint of a smile curved his scarred mouth. "Exactly like that." He returned his attention to the horses. "My father was Comanche. My mother was the daughter of a Texas Ranger. Neither community fully claim me, which makes me useful for certain types of work. Work like rescuing women from corrupt town jails. Work like investigating why 3 federal marshals have disappeared in this territory over the past year, and why Army supply wagons keep getting raided between Fort Laramie and outlying posts." His expression hardened. "Marshal Cooper was my friend. When his letters stopped coming, I requested the assignment to look into his disappearance." Abigail absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. "The quartermaster records the missing supplies." "That's what I found in my husband's papers after he died." Rivers nodded. "Lieutenant Monroe was investigating supply discrepancies before his death. His commanding officer forwarded his preliminary findings to the marshal's office." "His commanding officer?" Abigail frowned. "Colonel Hargrove told me James died in a Sioux ambush while on routine patrol. That's the official report." Rivers finished with the horses and sat across from her, his movements economical. "Does that sound like the kind of duty a quartermaster's assistant would be assigned?" A cold knot formed in Abigail's stomach. She'd questioned the circumstances of James's death from the beginning, but grief and the needs of her children had pushed those doubts aside. "Are you saying James was murdered too?" "I'm saying Lieutenant Monroe discovered something someone wanted kept quiet. Something worth killing for." Rivers produced a small package of jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, offering her a portion. The same thing that led to Marshal Cooper's murder when he started asking questions. Abigail accepted the food, her mind racing. "Wilcox and Mayor Fletcher. I saw them with Cooper the night before his body was found." Rivers leaned forward. "Tell me everything you remember about that meeting." As they ate, Abigail recounted what she'd witnessed at Walker's Creek. The confrontation, Cooper's mention of evidence, the veiled threats. Rivers listened intently, asking occasional questions about specific details, his expression darkening when she described Wilcox's reference to Lawman disappearing in the territories. "It fits the pattern," he said when she finished. "Army supplies get diverted, records are falsified. Anyone who investigates meets with an accident. The operation is too sophisticated for a small-town cattle baron like Wilcox to manage alone. You think there are others involved?" "I know there are. The question is how high it goes." Rivers brushed crumbs from his hands. "Cooper thought he'd identified the ringleader before he was killed. I need to find the evidence he gathered." "And I need to get my children back," Abigail said firmly. Rivers studied her. "Those 2 objectives might complement each other, Mrs. Monroe." "Abigail," she corrected, "if we're going to be allies in this, you should use my given name." Something shifted in his expression, respect perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. "Abigail, then, And you can call me Nate, at least when no one else is around. The small concession to informality humanized him somehow. Abigail found herself noticing details she'd missed before, the fatigue lines around his eyes, the careful way he favored his left side, suggesting an old injury. "How much farther to your camp?" she asked, as they prepared to continue their journey. "Another 2 hours, if we maintain our pace." He helped her back onto the mare, his hands respectful, but impersonal. The canyon offers natural protection, difficult to approach without being seen, with multiple escape routes if needed. "You're expecting trouble." "I'm always expecting trouble." There was no self-pity in the statement, just a pragmatic acceptance. "It's how I've stayed alive this long." The remainder of their journey passed in relative silence, both conserving energy as the terrain grew increasingly challenging. Abigail found herself drifting between consciousness and a strange half-sleep, lulled by the mare's steady gait and her own exhaustion. Only the occasional murmured direction from Rivers kept her oriented. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached their destination, the eastern sky painted in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Blackwater Canyon proved to be a rugged cleft in the rolling landscape, with high walls of red rock and a narrow entrance that would be easy to defend. A small cabin, nestled against the southern wall, partially concealed by a stand of juniper and cottonwood trees. A creek bubbled along the canyon floor, explaining the unexpected greenery in this otherwise arid landscape. "It's beautiful," Abigail murmured as they made their way down a switchback trail to the canyon floor. "And defensible," Rivers added, pragmatic as ever. "The Comanche used this place as a winter camp generations ago. My father showed it to me when I was a boy. The cabin itself was simple but sound. A single room with a stone fireplace, its construction suggesting it had been built in stages over many years. Inside, Abigail found it surprisingly comfortable, with a bed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding books and supplies, and cooking implements hanging neatly from hooks. "You can take the bed," Rivers said, setting down their few belongings. "I'll prepare something to eat, then we should both rest. Tonight we'll need to plan our next steps." Too exhausted to argue, Abigail sank onto the edge of the bed. "My children," she began, but Rivers cut her off with a raised hand. "We can't approach Redemption Creek immediately. By now, Jenkins has men watching every trail, and Wilcox will have doubled security around his ranch where your children are, being kept. But Thomas, he's just a baby. He needs me." The thought of her infant son, colicky and refusing goat's milk, brought tears to her eyes. Rivers' expression softened fractionally. "I understand your urgency, but rushing in without proper preparation would endanger us all, including your children." He moved to the fireplace, building a small fire with practiced efficiency. "Give yourself today to recover your strength. You're no good to Mary and Thomas half dead from exhaustion." The logic was irrefutable, but maternal instinct warred against prudence. "How long?" 2 days, perhaps 3, to gather intelligence and prepare." He set a pot of water over the growing flames. "I have contacts who can tell us exactly what's happening in Redemption Creek without alerting Wilcox to our presence." Abigail wanted to protest further, but a wave of dizziness reminded her of her physical limitations. She'd been without proper food and water for over 30 hours before Rebecca's intervention, and the journey had depleted what little reserves. She'd had 2 days, she conceded reluctantly. "Not a moment longer." Rivers nodded, accepting her terms without argument. As he prepared a simple meal of cornmeal mush sweetened with dried apples, Abigail took stock of her situation. 24 hours ago, she'd been resigned to death in a jail cell. Now she was miles from Redemption Creek, in a hidden canyon with a half-Comanche former marshal who clearly had his own agenda regarding Wilcox and his operation. The question was whether that agenda would help or hinder her primary goal, recovering Her children. Why did you really rescue me? She asked as Rivers placed a bowl of steaming food before her. You could have investigated Cooper's death without involving me. Rivers considered her question, his mismatched eyes unreadable. Cooper's last message mentioned a witness to his meeting with Wilcox and Fletcher. When I learned you'd been arrested for his murder, the connection seemed obvious. He paused. But there was another reason. Which was? Your husband. Rivers sat across from her, his own bowl untouched. James Monroe saved my life during the Platte River campaign 3 years ago. Our patrol was ambushed. He could have retreated with the others, but he came back for me. The revelation stunned Abigail. James had never mentioned this incident in his letters. He never told me. He probably couldn't. My work for the army was unofficial. Rivers finally took a spoonful of his food. I owe him a debt. Helping his family is the least I can do to honor that. The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Abigail felt tears threatening again, not from fear or desperation this time, but from the unexpected connection to her husband. James had been gone over 6 months, but here was a piece of him she hadn't known existed. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me that. After they ate, Rivers insisted she rest while he tended to the horses and secured the perimeter. Despite her intention to remain vigilant, Abigail fell into a deep sleep almost immediately upon lying down, her body surrendering to its overwhelming need for recovery. She woke to lengthening shadows and the smell of coffee. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. The unfamiliar ceiling, the sound of water nearby, the absence of town noises. Then memory flooded back, bringing with it renewed anxiety about her children. Rivers sat at the table, a map spread before him, making notes in a small leather-bound journal. He looked up as she stirred. You've been asleep for nearly 10 hours, he said, rising to pour her coffee. How do you feel? Abigail took mental inventory. The dizziness had subsided, and while her muscles ached from the unaccustomed riding, her mind felt clearer than it had since her arrest. Better, she admitted, accepting the tin cup. Stronger. Good. We have work to do. Rivers gestured to the map. This is Wilcox's ranch, about 4 miles outside Redemption Creek. According to my information, that's where your children are being kept. Abigail studied the crude drawing, noting the main house, bunkhouse, and outbuildings. How did you get this? I spent 3 weeks watching the place before I came for you. Rivers tapped a small structure near what appeared to be a garden. This is where Martha Wilcox spends most of her afternoons, a sort of tea house. She's likely keeping your daughter with her. And Thomas? Probably in the main house. Wilcox has hired a new wet nurse, a young widow from Cottonwood Junction. The revelation that another woman was nursing her baby sent a stab of pain through Abigail's heart, but she forced herself to focus on the practical implications. So both children are in separate locations within the ranch, Rivers nodded. Which complicates matters. We'll need to coordinate carefully to retrieve them both simultaneously. Abigail challenged. I thought this was your mission of justice. Why risk yourself further for my children? Something like surprise flickered across Rivers' face. I gave you my word, Abigail. Your children are part of this now, whether I like it or not. The simple declaration disarmed her. In a world where men's promises had proven worthless, from the mayor's civic assurances to the sheriff's oath to uphold the law, Rivers' matter-of-fact commitment stood in stark contrast. Besides, he added with the faintest hint of that crooked smile, I need you focused on helping me find Cooper's evidence, not distracted by worry for your children. You think his evidence is still in Redemption Creek? I think Cooper hid it, somewhere before his final meeting with Wilcox and Fletcher. Rivers shuffled through some papers. His last message to me mentioned insurance he'd placed somewhere safe. The schoolhouse, Abigail said suddenly, a memory surfacing. The day Before he died, I saw the marshal at the old schoolhouse. It's been abandoned since last winter when the roof partially collapsed. Rivers looked up sharply. Did anyone else see him there? I don't think so. It was early morning and the building sits at the edge of town. Abigail frowned, thinking. I only noticed because I used to teach there before Mary was born. It seemed odd that a U.S. Marshal would be interested in a condemned building. The perfect hiding place, Rivers mused. Somewhere no one would casually visit, but with a connection. To you, the teacher who sent the letters that brought him to Redemption Creek. A plan was taking shape between them. Unspoken but increasingly clear, they would need to return to Redemption Creek to retrieve both Abigail's children and the evidence Cooper had hidden. And they would need to do it right under the noses of the men who wanted them dead. When do we start? Abigail asked, the last vestiges of her former life falling away as she met Rivers' mismatched gaze across the table. Tomorrow, he replied. We begin at sundown. Dawn found Abigail at the creek's edge, scrubbing her skin with sand and cold water. 3 days of captivity had left a layer of grime she was desperate to remove, as if washing away the jail's filth could somehow cleanse the memory of her ordeal. Her ribs still ached where Wilcox's men had struck her, the bruises blossoming in shades of purple and yellow across her pale skin. Nate had respectfully withdrawn to hunt, giving her privacy for this necessary ritual. Before leaving, he'd placed a bundle of clothing near the water, a pair of buckskin trousers, a cotton shirt, and a worn leather vest, all clearly made for someone smaller than himself. When Abigail questioned their origin, he'd simply said, they belong to someone who no longer needs them, and walked away before she could press further. The clothes fit surprisingly well, though the trousers required a piece of rope as a belt. Practical garments for riding and stealth, not the attire of a schoolteacher or a lieutenant's wife. But Abigail was neither of those things anymore. She was combing her damp hair with her fingers when Nate returned, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He paused at the sight of her in the borrowed clothes, something unreadable flickering across his scarred face. Better, he asked, gesturing to her transformed appearance. Cleaner, at least. Abigail straightened, squaring her shoulders against his scrutiny. These clothes, were they your mother's? His expression shuttered. My wife's. The revelation caught her off guard. Though she'd spent hours in his company, Nate had revealed almost nothing personal beyond his mixed heritage and his connection to James. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't realize. It was a long time ago. He moved past her toward the cabin, his tone closing the subject. She was about your size. She would have approved of them being used for a practical purpose. Abigail followed him, curiosity warring with respect for his privacy. What happened to her? Nate was silent so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a carefully controlled neutrality. Smallpox, 8 years ago at Fort Defiance. I was away tracking Comanchero raiders when the outbreak started. He began preparing the rabbits for cooking with precise, economical movements. By the time I returned, Hannah was gone, along with a third of the fort's population. Fort Defiance. The name stirred something in Abigail's memory, James mentioning it in his final letter. My husband wrote about Fort Defiance before he died. Something about a man named Jacob Greyhorse. Nate's hand stilled momentarily. Jacob was my mother's brother, a scout for the army, like I was. He died at Platte. River, in the same ambush where your husband saved my life. The connections between their lives continued to multiply, weaving a pattern Abigail couldn't yet fully discern. I'm sorry for your losses. Both of them. Nate acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod, then returned to his task. Loss is the price of survival out here. The wise learn from it. The foolish let it destroy them. He glanced up, his mismatched eyes intense. Which are you, Abigail Monroe? The question wasn't posed as a challenge, but an assessment. She considered her answer carefully. 6 months ago, I was barely functioning after James died. I went through the motions of living for my children's sake, but something in me was dormant. She ran her fingers over the rough fabric of the borrowed vest. Then I found his notes about the supply discrepancies. Investigating gave me purpose again. Understanding why he died became more important than simply mourning that he had. Nate studied her, then nodded, as if confirming something to himself. That's why Cooper trusted you with his location. He recognized a kindred spirit, someone who values truth above comfort. As they prepared the morning meal together, Nate outlined his plan for their return to Redemption Creek. They would travel separately, Abigail disguised as a young Comanche man, Nate, presenting himself openly as a bounty hunter seeking information about an escaped prisoner. Bounty hunters are common enough in these territories that my presence won't raise immediate suspicion, he explained, sketching a rough map of their approach route. And Wilcox's men will be looking for a white woman, not a native youth. I can't speak Comanche, Abigail pointed out, and my riding skills are hardly convincing. You won't need to speak. My mother's people believe silence conveys wisdom in the young. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. As for riding, we have all day to improve your skills. The basics will be sufficient. You'll mainly need to look the part from a distance. After breakfast, they moved to a flat section of the canyon where Nate had established a small corral for the horses. What followed was the most intensive riding lesson of Abigail's life. Nate was a demanding but patient teacher, demonstrating the differences between Western and Comanche riding styles, then guiding her through countless repetitions. The Comanche are the finest horsemen on the plains, he explained, adjusting her posture on the dun mare. They move as one with their mounts, no wasted motion, no unnecessary signals. The horse becomes an extension of the rider's will. By midday, Abigail's muscles burned from the unaccustomed exercise, but she'd mastered the basics of riding bareback with just a hackamore, controlling the horse primarily with her legs and weight shifts rather than reins. The skill both exhilarated and humbled her. You learn quickly, Nate observed during their brief rest. Most white women would have given up after the first fall. Abigail rubbed her sore hip where she'd hit the ground during an early attempt at a quick turn. Most white women haven't spent 3 days in jail contemplating their children being raised by their would-be murderers. Nate acknowledged her point with a slight inclination of his head. Motivation matters, but so does natural aptitude. He passed her a water skin. Your disguise will need one more element. We'll need to darken your skin. That afternoon, Nate prepared a mixture of walnut hulls, clay, and bear fat. The resulting paste had a pungent, earthy scent that reminded Abigail of the forest after rain. He demonstrated its application on his own arm, creating a slightly deeper tone than his natural copper coloring. This won't wash off easily, but it will fade gradually, he explained, handing her the small pot. Apply it to any exposed skin, face, neck, hands. I'll help with your hair later. As Abigail carefully darkened her fair complexion, she found herself contemplating the strange turns her life had taken. A month ago, the idea of disguising herself as a Comanche youth would have seemed absurd, even improper. Now it felt like a practical necessity, no different from choosing the right tool for a difficult task. What changed you? She asked Nate. As they continued preparations, from Army Scout to Marshal to... She gestured vaguely, unsure how to categorize his current role. He considered the question while checking the loads in his Remington revolver. I straddled 2 worlds from birth, never fully accepted in either. For a time, I believed I could bridge that gap, help the army understand the native peoples, and help my mother's relatives adapt to changing times. His face hardened. I was naive. What happened? I watched treaties broken before the ink was dry, saw peaceful camps slaughtered under flags of truce, delivered empty promises to chiefs who knew they were being lied to but had no choice but to accept. His voice remained even, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. After Hannah died, I had nothing left to lose. I decided if I couldn't serve either world fully, I would at least serve justice as I understood it. And justice led you to Marshal Cooper. Cooper was one of the few who saw the corruption for what it was, not just isolated incidents of frontier lawlessness, but an organized operation stealing from both the government and the tribes. Nate secured his weapon, movements precise. Men like Wilcox are symptoms. Cooper was tracking the disease to its source. As evening approached, Nate helped Abigail complete her disguise. He darkened her auburn hair with a mixture of charcoal and bare fat, then showed her how to braid it in the style of a young Comanche warrior. When she glanced at her reflection in a small mirror, a stranger looked back, a copper-skinned youth with dark, serious eyes. "Remember to keep your head slightly lowered," Nate instructed, adjusting the angle of her chin. "Your eyes are distinctive. Too, I'm pale for a full blood. In poor light, you'll pass inspection, but don't invite direct scrutiny." They packed lightly for the journey, weapons, minimal provisions, and a small collection of tools Nate deemed essential. Among these was a slender metal implement Abigail didn't recognize. "Skeleton key," Nate explained when she inquired. "Opens most common locks. Not as elegant as the duplicate I used for your cell, but more versatile." "Where did you learn such skills?" Abigail asked, watching him pack the tool carefully in an oilskin pouch. "My father was a thief before he became a warrior," Nate replied matter-of-factly. "He believed practical knowledge was more valuable than moral superiority." A sentiment your husband appeared to share, given how quickly he acquired the jail key patterns during his own investigation. The casual revelation stunned Abigail. "James made that duplicate, the one you used." Nate nodded, continuing his preparations. "Left it with Jacob for safekeeping along with other materials. Apparently he suspected he might not be the only one at risk." He glanced at her. "Your husband was more complicated than perhaps you knew, Abigail." The statement wasn't meant unkindly, but it struck a nerve nonetheless. How well had she really known James? The man who'd shared her bed and fathered her children had also been investigating corruption, making duplicate keys and cultivating connections with men like Nate Rivers, all without her knowledge. "We leave at dusk," Nate said, interrupting her thoughts. "Sleep if you can. Tomorrow will test us both." But sleep proved elusive. As Abigail lay on the narrow bed, her mind churned with new information and mounting anxiety about the task ahead. James had been investigating the same corruption that had ultimately claimed his life. Had he known the danger? Had he suspected Wilcox's involvement? And what of her children? How were they faring under Martha Wilcox's care? A floorboard creaked, and she opened her eyes to find Nate standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading daylight. "Your thoughts are too loud," he observed quietly. "Sorry," she murmured, sitting up. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't." He moved to the table, lighting a small oil lamp. Its warm glow softened the harsh angles of his face, making him appear younger, less weathered. "I've been considering our approach. There's something you should know before we reach Redemption Creek." The solemnity in his tone sent a chill through her. "What is it?" Nate placed a folded paper on the table between them. "This arrived by courier last week, just before I came for you. It's from an army clerk at Fort Laramie who's been helping with my investigation." Abigail unfolded the document with growing apprehension. It was a copy of an official report, James's death certificate, with Colonel Hargrove's signature at the bottom. But contrary to what she'd been told, it didn't list Sioux ambush as the cause of death. It listed gunshot wound to the back, origin undetermined. Her hands trembled as she read the clinical description. James hadn't died in combat, but had been shot from behind, executed. The report had been altered before being provided to her, the truth buried beneath official condolences and a flag-draped coffin. "He knew too much," Nate said softly. "Just like Cooper, just like you." Abigail stared at the document, grief giving way to a cold, clarifying rage. "Hargrove is part of this. It appears so, which means the corruption extends beyond redemption, Greek, into the highest levels of the territorial command." Nate sat across from her, his expression grave. "This is bigger than Wilcox stealing army supplies, Abigail. This is systematic plunder on a massive scale, weapons diverted to hostile tribes to justify increased military budgets, supplies reported destroyed, then sold to settlements at inflated prices, land seized from hostile natives, then magically appearing in the property portfolios of certain officers. And James discovered this, parts of it, enough to get himself killed." Nate tapped the document. "Cooper was collecting evidence against Hargrove specifically when he disappeared. I believe that's what he hid in the old schoolhouse. Documentation that would connect Hargrove to the operation and implicate whoever is protecting him in Washington." Abigail processed this information, connecting it to her own discoveries in James's papers. "The supply manifests I found, they showed discrepancies in weapons shipments, not just food and blankets." "Exactly. Thousands of rifles and ammunition reported damaged in transit, written off the books." Nate's eyes held hers. "Those same weapons later appeared in Comanche and Apache raids, leading to retaliatory campaigns that conveniently required more supplies, more troops, more money flowing from Washington." "A war manufactured for profit," Abigail whispered, the full scope of the conspiracy dawning on her. "But why would Hargrove involve someone like Wilcox? A colonel could find more sophisticated partners. Frontier towns are ideal hubs for this kind of operation, remote enough to escape scrutiny, but connected enough to move goods. Wilcox controls Redemption Creek completely, from the sheriff to the telegraph operator, and he has connections with traders who supply the reservations." Nate folded the death certificate carefully. "Men like Wilcox are valuable to men like Hargrove, ruthless, greedy, and expendable if necessary." The enormity of what they were facing settled over Abigail, like a physical weight. They weren't just going against a corrupt town boss, but elements of the U.S. Army itself. The danger had multiplied exponentially. "We should reconsider our approach," Nate continued, studying her reaction. "If we focus solely on retrieving your children, we might avoid drawing Hargrove's attention." The suggestion surprised her. "You would abandon Cooper's evidence after coming this far?" Nate's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm acknowledging the increased risk. Your children's safety is the priority. You said so yourself." Abigail rose, moving to the cabin's small window. The canyon was bathed in the deep blue of approaching twilight, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. She thought of James, shot in the back by men he should have been able to trust, of Cooper meeting a similar fate for daring to investigate, of her own children, pawns in a game whose scale she was only beginning to comprehend. "If we don't expose this," she said finally, turning back to Nate, "how many more will die? How many other children will lose their parents to this corruption?" Something like admiration flickered in his mismatched eyes. "It's not your fight, Abigail. They made it my fight when they killed my husband, when they locked me in that cell to die, when they took my children." Her voice was steady, conviction replacing uncertainty. "We retrieve both, my children and Cooper's evidence. James deserves justice as much as Daniel Cooper did." Nate studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Understood." He rose, extinguishing the lamp. "We should move out. There's a half moon tonight. Enough light to travel, not enough to make us conspicuous." They prepared in silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. As Abigail adjusted the buckskin clothing one final time, checking that her darkened skin showed no telltale patches of paleness, Nate approached with something held carefully in his hands. "This belonged to my wife," he said, offering her a beaded leather necklace with a small silver pendant. Among the Comanche, it's believed to offer protection to those who travel dangerous paths. The gesture, so unexpected from this stoic, reserved man, caught Abigail by surprise. "I couldn't possibly—" "Hannah would have wanted you to have it," he interrupted quietly. "She, too, was a woman who chose justice over safety." Abigail accepted the necklace, recognizing the gift for what it was, not merely a practical addition to her disguise, but a symbolic gesture of trust and alliance. She slipped it over her head, the silver pendant cool against her skin. "Thank you," she said simply. Nate acknowledged her thanks with a slight nod, then turned toward the waiting horses. "Stay close until we reach the foothills, then maintain distance, as we discussed. If anything goes wrong, I make for the lightning-struck oak east of town. Wait 2 hours, then return to the canyon if you don't appear," Abigail recited, mounting the dun mare with newfound confidence. "I remember." As they rode out of the canyon into the gathering darkness, Abigail felt the weight of multiple responsibilities settling around her. Her children waited, unaware their mother was coming for them. James's killers continued their operations, untroubled by accountability, and somewhere in Redemption Creek, evidence lay hidden that could bring down a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of territorial authority. The disguise she wore was fitting, she reflected. She truly had become someone new. Not just Abigail, Monroe, widow and mother, but a pursuer of justice, a keeper of dangerous secrets, a woman willing to risk everything to right cascading wrongs. The moon rose higher as they rode southeast toward Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the scrubland. Behind them, Blackwater Canyon disappeared into darkness, their temporary sanctuary reduced to memory as they advanced into uncertainty. Ahead lay Redemption Creek, a frontier town whose name had become an irony, a place now defined by corruption rather than salvation. Somewhere within its limits, Martha Wilcox tended to children not her own, unaware that their mother approached like a shadow on the night wind. Somewhere within its limits, Cooper's evidence waited, the dead marshal's final testimony against those who had murdered him for his dedication to the law. And somewhere beyond it all, Colonel Hargrove continued his operations, unsuspecting that the widow of a man he had ordered killed was now riding toward a reckoning he could not anticipate. Abigail straightened in the saddle, adopting the fluid posture Nate had taught her. The silver pendant rested against her breastbone, a talisman of courage borrowed from another woman who had faced darkness without flinching. Tomorrow would bring either justice or death, perhaps both. But as the half-moon climbed higher in the vast western sky, Abigail Monroe felt something she had not experienced since the day Sheriff Jenkins had locked her cell door. Hope, small but inextinguishable, like the distant stars, guiding their way through the wilderness. Redemption Creek appeared through the morning mist like a mirage rising from the plains, a scattered collection of wooden buildings straddling the dusty main road, the church steeple on one end balanced by the gallows frame at the other. From their vantage point on a low ridge 1/2 mile east of town, Abigail studied the place that had nearly become her tomb. It looked smaller somehow, less substantial than the community that had dominated her life since James's death. "Remember, your role," Nate murmured beside her, his voice barely audible above the soft prairie breeze. "No English, no direct eye contact with anyone. Stay near the trading post, but remain inconspicuous." Abigail nodded, adjusting the worn blanket draped across her shoulders. In her Comanche disguise, she was nearly unrecognizable. Skin darkened to a deep copper, hair braided tightly against her skull, body language altered to reflect the watchful reserve Nate had coached her to adopt. Even her own children would struggle to identify her at a distance. The thought of Mary and Thomas sent a fresh pang through her heart. So close now, yet still beyond reach, until their careful plan could unfold. "The town looks quiet," she observed, scanning for any unusual activity. "Too quiet." Nate's mismatched eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. Tuesday morning should see more movement, ranchers coming in for supplies, the stage from Fort Laramie. Abigail followed his gaze, noting the absence of the usual bustle. Jenkins must still have men searching the outlying areas. Likely. Nate checked his weapons one final time. The Remington revolver at his hip, the knife sheathed at his back, and a smaller Derringer concealed in his boot. "We proceed as planned, but be alert for any changes. Meet at the schoolhouse at noon, as arranged." With that, he urged his buckskin forward, descending toward town at an unhurried pace while Abigail remained on the ridge, counting slowly to 500 as they'd agreed. His approach would be direct, a bounty hunter arriving openly to inquire about the escaped prisoner and the reward Wilcox had posted. Her path would be circuitous, entering town from the south as if she were a young Comanche coming to trade at Parker's General Store, one of the few establishments that still dealt fairly with native customers. When Abigail finally nudged her, mare forward, she focused on maintaining the riding posture Nate had drilled into her, back straight but relaxed, movements flowing with the horse rather than against it. The transformation went beyond physical appearance. She had to embody a different way of moving through the world, alert to dangers her settler self might have overlooked. She circled wide to the south, approaching Redemption Creek along the creek itself, where a small Comanche trading party occasionally camped during the spring months. The familiar landscape looked different from horseback, landmarks shifting perspective in ways that momentarily disoriented her. When she reached the stand of cottonwoods that marked the town's informal boundary, she paused, observing the settlement through new eyes. Two men loitered outside the sheriff's office, rifles cradled in their arms. Not regular deputies, but hired guns, based on their trail-worn appearance. The saloon's doors stood open despite the early hour, while the smithy remained silent, no smoke rising from its forge. Most telling was the telegraph office, where the operator sat on the front porch rather than at his desk inside, clearly positioned to monitor arrivals from the East Road. They're waiting for something, Abigail realized, or someone. Keeping to the plan, she guided her mare toward Parker's store at the south end of town, maintaining the deliberate pace of someone with no particular urgency. As she approached, she noted with relief that old Parker himself was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his establishment, his stooped figure unmistakable even at a distance. Oscar Parker had been one of the few townspeople who'd shown genuine sympathy after James's death, often slipping extra supplies into Abigail's purchases without charging for them. His wife had been Cheyenne, dead now 5 years from consumption, but the trader maintained fair relations with the indigenous people who brought furs and crafts to exchange for manufactured goods. Abigail dismounted at the hitching post, keeping her head slightly lowered as Nate had instructed. She secured the mare, then approached the store with the proper mixture of caution and purpose. Parker glanced up, assessing her with the practiced eye of a frontier trader. If he noticed anything unusual about her appearance, he gave no sign of it. "Good morning, young man," he greeted in the simplified English he used with his native customers. "You come to trade?" Abigail made the hand gesture Nate had taught her, agreement without words, and followed the old man into the store. The familiar sense of coffee beans, tobacco, and leather goods washed over her, triggering memories of shopping here with Mary perched on her hip, the little girl enchanted by the colorful bolts of fabric and glass jars of candy. She forced the memory aside, focusing on her role. From the small pouch at her waist, she produced 3 rabbit pelts Nate had prepared for this purpose, laying them on the counter with careful deliberation. Good quality, Parker commented, examining the furs. You want coffee? Sugar? He gestured to the shelves behind him. When Abigail pointed to a small sack of coffee beans, the trader nodded approval. Good choice. Best beans from Mexico. I add tobacco too, yes? For your father. Another gesture of agreement. As Parker measured the goods, Abigail allowed her gaze to wander the store, noting the new wanted poster displayed prominently near the door. Her own face stared back at her, the artist's rendering surprisingly accurate beneath the bold letters, "Escaped murderer, $200 reward." Bad business with the schoolteacher, Parker remarked, following her gaze. Whole town's upside down looking for her. He leaned closer, voice dropping. Between us, something doesn't smell right about it. Mrs. Monroe wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone a marshal. Abigail kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse quickened at this unexpected support. Parker continued packaging her goods, speaking in the measured cadence he reserved for important information. Sheriff's got men watching every trail out of the county. Wilcox brought in extra hands from his North Range, even sent a telegram to Fort Laramie requesting soldiers. He tied the package with string. Colonel himself is riding in tomorrow, they say. The news sent ice through Abigail's veins. Colonel Hargrove, James's commander and likely his murderer, coming to Redemption Creek personally. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Strange times. Parker continued, sliding the package across the counter. Strange doings all around. Take care on the trails, young man. Some of these new fellows don't distinguish between friendly tribes and hostile ones. Abigail accepted the package with a respectful nod, adding a gesture of thanks. As she turned to leave, the store's door swung open, revealing a familiar broad-shouldered figure. Frank Miller, Wilcox's foreman, and the man who'd struck her during her arrest. Miller paused in the doorway, eyes narrowing as he studied Abigail. Didn't know you were entertaining Injuns today, Parker. Paying customer, Parker replied mildly. Unlike some I could mention. The foreman grunted, moving aside reluctantly to let Abigail pass. She kept her pace unhurried, her gaze downcast, though every instinct screamed to run as she felt Miller's suspicious stare boring into her back. "Hold up there, boy," Miller called as she reached her horse. "Don't recognize you from the usual trading parties." Abigail froze, one hand on the mare's bridle. This moment wasn't part of the plan, direct confrontation so soon after entering town. She turned slowly, keeping her face partially shadowed by the blanket draped over her shoulder. Miller advanced, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. "I asked you a question, Injun. Where's your people camped?" "He doesn't speak English, Miller." Parker had followed them outside, broom still in hand. "Leave the boy be. He's just doing some trading for his family." Awful convenient time for strange Indians to show up, don't you think? Miller's eyes narrowed. "With a murderer on the loose." "A woman murderer," Parker emphasized. "Unless you think Mrs. Monroe magically transformed into a Comanche boy." Several townspeople had paused to observe the confrontation, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Among them, Abigail spotted Rebecca Holloway, the midwife who had risked herself to bring food and water to the jail. Their eyes met briefly, and something like recognition flickered across Rebecca's face before she carefully smoothed her expression. The moment hung in dangerous balance until a new voice broke the tension. "Problem here, gentlemen?" Nate Rivers strolled toward them, his bounty hunter persona fully assumed, confident bordering on arrogant, hand resting casually near his holster, eyes assessing the situation with professional interest. Miller turned, irritation evident in his stance. "Who's asking?" "Name's Rivers, tracking an escaped prisoner from the territorial prison at Yuma." Nate flashed a battered tin star. Not the U.S. Marshal's badge, but something that suggested official authority without specifying its nature. "Heard there might be other reward money available locally." The strategic redirection worked. Miller's Attention shifted from Abigail to this new potential ally in their manhunt. You'd be hearing about the Monroe woman. Monroe. Nate feigned mild interest. That the school teacher who killed the federal marshal. Passed a posse searching for her. Near Apache Wells 3 days back, have you seen her? Miller's posture changed instantly, suspicion giving way to eagerness. Glimpsed someone matching the description, heading southwest. Nate shrugged. Didn't realize it was connected to this jurisdiction until I hit town just now. Saw the poster. In the saloon. Miller glanced back at Abigail, his focus already waning as more pressing concerns took precedence. You should check in with Sheriff Jenkins. Mr. Wilcox is offering $200 for information, $300 for the woman herself. Appreciate the tip. Nate tipped his hat, then glanced at Abigail with the casual disinterest of a man who viewed natives as part of the landscape rather than as people. This one causing trouble? Just being cautious, Miller muttered, already turning away. Too many strangers lately for comfort. As Miller strode toward the sheriff's office, presumably to report the bounty hunter's information, Parker returned to his sweeping with the air of a man deliberately minding his own business. Nate gave Abigail an almost imperceptible nod before, continuing down the street toward the jail, maintaining their facade of unfamiliarity, Abigail mounted her mare with practiced ease, the first test of their deception successfully navigated. She guided her horse toward the back of Parker's store, where a water trough offered a legitimate reason to linger. As she allowed the animal to drink, Rebecca Holloway approached, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip as if she were merely passing by on household errands. That man doesn't know what he's walking into, the midwife murmured, adjusting her burden while seemingly speaking to herself. Jenkins has 4 men inside the jail, waiting for anyone asking questions about the escape. Abigail remained silent, eyes fixed on her horse. Mary cried for her mother all night, Rebecca continued softly. The baby won't keep down the goat's milk. Martha Wilcox is at her wit's end with both of them. She glanced around to ensure they weren't observed. The old schoolhouse was searched yesterday. Whatever they were looking for, they didn't find it. The news both relieved and concerned Abigail. Cooper's evidence remained hidden, but her children were suffering in her absence. She made a subtle gesture of thanks, hoping Rebecca would understand. "Be careful," the midwife whispered, moving away. "Wilcox knows someone helped you escape. He's out for blood." As Rebecca disappeared around the corner, Abigail considered their next steps. Nate was likely walking into a trap at the jail, though he'd anticipated such a reception. Their plan accounted for Jenkins's suspicion of strangers using it to create opportunities elsewhere, while attention focused on the bounty hunter. She guided her mare casually toward the church at the north end of town, maintaining the unhurried pace of someone with no particular destination. The old schoolhouse stood behind it, partially concealed by a stand of elm trees that had grown wild since the building's abandonment. The small, weathered structure looked even more dilapidated than Abigail remembered, roof sagging where snow had collapsed a section the previous winter, windows boarded haphazardly, the front steps rotting. A forbidding chain and padlock secured the door, evidence of the search Rebecca had mentioned. Abigail circled the building at a discreet distance, assessing approach routes and potential hiding places. According to their plan, she would meet Nate here at noon, using the church bells tolling as cover for their rendezvous. Until then, she needed to remain visible enough to establish her presence as an unremarkable Comanche youth, yet inconspicuous enough to avoid further scrutiny. She made her way toward the livery stable, where native traders often gathered to rest and water their horses. The hostler, a grizzled veteran of the Mexican War, barely glanced up as she approached, merely pointing to the communal water barrel at the side of the building, as Abigail allowed her mare to drink alongside 2 other horses. She observed the town's rhythms from this new vantage point. The unusual quietness she'd noted earlier persisted, with fewer townspeople than normal conducting their daily business. Those who did venture out moved with a wariness that suggested an underlying tension. Conversations hushed, gazes flicking, towards strangers with suspicion. From the direction of the jail came raised voices, followed by the distinctive sound of a fist connecting with flesh. Abigail resisted the urge to look directly toward the disturbance, maintaining her disinterested facade while straining to hear. She caught fragments only. Bounty hunter. Questions. Search him. Before the jail door slammed shut, cutting off the commotion. Part of their plan involved Nate allowing himself to be detained temporarily, establishing his cover identity through a display of indignation at such treatment. The calculated risk would keep Jenkins and his deputies occupied while Abigail prepared for their next phase. The church bell rang at 10 o'clock. 2 hours until their planned meeting at the schoolhouse, assuming Nate extracted himself from the jail as anticipated. Abigail led her mare toward a patch of shade near the smithy, settling cross-legged on the ground, as if preparing for a brief rest. From this position, she could observe both the jail and the road leading to Wilcox's ranch, without appearing to pay particular attention to either. As she sat in apparent meditation, her mind raced through contingencies. If Nate failed to appear at noon, she would proceed alone to scout the ranch where her children were held. If he did arrive, they would search the schoolhouse for Cooper's hidden evidence, then move on to the ranch by nightfall. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching her nerves tighter. A wagon rumbled down the main street, Mrs. Peterson taking eggs to market, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. 2 ranch hands emerged from the saloon, arguing amiably about a card game. Sheriff Jenkins himself appeared briefly on the jailhouse porch, scanning the street with narrowed eyes before disappearing back inside. At 11:30, movement at the south end of town drew Abigail's attention. 3 riders approached at a steady pace, their military bearing evident even at a distance. As they drew closer, Abigail's blood ran cold. The lead rider wore a colonel's uniform, his silver hair and trim beard instantly recognizable from the photographs James had kept. Colonel Edward Hargrove had arrived a day earlier than expected. The implications cascaded through Abigail's mind. Their carefully constructed timeline is now worthless, their advantage of preparation evaporating. Worse, Hargrove's presence suggested an escalation. He wouldn't ride personally into a frontier town unless something significant had occurred. The colonel and his escorts, a lieutenant and a sergeant based on their insignia, reined in before the sheriff's office. Jenkins emerged immediately, his usual swagger subdued in the presence of military authority. Words were exchanged, too distant for Abigail to hear. Then all 4 men entered the jail. Abigail rose slowly, gathering her mare's reins with deliberate calm while her thoughts raced. She needed to warn Nate, but approaching the jail now would be suicidal. Their noon meeting at the schoolhouse was still the safest option, assuming Nate could extricate himself from whatever situation was unfolding inside. She led her horse toward the church, maintaining an unhurried pace while calculating her next move. The building's side door likely remained unlocked for daily prayers, offering a vantage point from which to observe the schoolhouse without exposing herself. As she secured her mare to a hitching post, partially concealed by overgrown lilac bushes, the church door opened. Reverend Phillips stepped out, his tall figure stooped with age, but his eyes still sharp beneath bushy white brows. He paused at the sight of Abigail, head tilting in consideration. "Good morning, young friend," he said gently in the simplified English most townspeople used with native visitors. "You come to pray?" Abigail lowered her gaze, making the non-committal gesture that had served her thus far. The Reverend studied her for a moment longer than comfort allowed. "God's house welcomes all his children," he continued, switching unexpectedly. to fluid Comanche that left Abigail momentarily stunned, even those who wear faces not their own. Her head snapped up, meeting his knowing gaze directly for the first time. The Reverend smiled sadly, reverting to English. 20 years ministering to the Comanche gives one certain insight, Mrs. Monroe. His voice remained low, gentle. Your disguise is admirable, but your eyes, they remain your own. Fear closed Abigail's throat, her carefully constructed plan unraveling before it had truly begun. The Reverend raised a placating hand. Be at peace, child. I have no love for injustice, nor for men who imprison innocent women. He glanced toward the jail. The arrival of the colonel suggests matters are progressing more quickly than you anticipated. Your friend inside may need assistance sooner than planned. Abigail found her voice, though she kept it to a whisper. You know about Nate? Mr. Rivers visited my church early this morning, seeking sanctuary rites, not for himself, but for evidence he hoped to recover. Reverend Phillips smiled at her surprise. The sanctity of the confessional extends to all who seek truth, Mrs. Monroe, not merely those who attend Sunday services. The evidence is not in the schoolhouse, despite what your martial friend believes. The Reverend glanced around, ensuring they remained unobserved. Daniel Cooper entrusted it to me the night before his death, sensing his investigation had been compromised. Hope and suspicion warred within Abigail. Why would he give church evidence against Wilcox? Because churches endure when men fall, Phillips replied simply. And because he knew my history with the Comanche would make me sympathetic to exposing those who profit from manufacturing conflict with native peoples. A shout from the direction of the jail interrupted their conversation. The door had burst open, deputies spilling onto the porch with weapons drawn. In their midst stood Colonel Hargrove, his face flushed with anger as he gesticulated toward the livery stable. Inside, quickly, Reverend Phillips urged, opening the church door. Events are accelerating beyond our control. Abigail hesitated, torn between the need for shelter and concern for Nate. Before she could decide, gunshots echoed from the direction of the jail. One, then two more in rapid succession. God help us, the Reverend murmured, pulling Abigail firmly inside the church. The reckoning began before we were prepared. The interior of the church enveloped Abigail in familiar scents, beeswax candles, old hymnals, and the lingering trace of Sunday's flowers. Reverend Phillips guided her quickly past the nave to a narrow door behind the pulpit that led to his private study. Outside, the commotion intensified, men shouting orders, boots pounding on packed earth, the distinctive jingling of cavalry tack. What's happening? Abigail whispered as the Reverend secured the door behind them. I fear your friend has been discovered. Phillips moved to a small window overlooking the street, his weathered face grave. The colonel arrived with specific intelligence. Someone warned him about Rivers. Abigail joined him at the window, careful to remain partially concealed by the faded curtain. The scene outside confirmed her worst fears. A dozen men had formed a perimeter around the jail, a mixture of Jenkins' deputies and Wilcox's ranch hands. Colonel Hargrove stood on the porch, issuing commands with the confidence of a man accustomed to unquestioning obedience. There was no sign of Nate. Was he? Abigail couldn't finish the question, the gunshots they'd heard still echoing in her mind. I don't believe so, Phillips reassured her. Those shots were fired into the air, not at a target. A signal, perhaps, or a warning. The Reverend turned from the window, moving to a battered oak desk that dominated the small room. From a hidden compartment beneath a false drawer bottom, he withdrew a slim oilskin packet. Marshal Cooper's evidence, he explained, placing it carefully on the desk. Documents implicating Hargrove, Wilcox, and others in a conspiracy that spans 3 territories. Supply manifests, banking records, witness testimonies. Enough to Ensure multiple hangings if it reached the proper authorities. Abigail stared at the unassuming package. Why didn't you come forward with this after Cooper's murder? To whom? Phillips asked with gentle irony. The sheriff who reports to Wilcox, the territorial governor who dines with Hargrove, the newspaper editor who won't print a word without Wilcox's approval? He shook his head. Cooper instructed me to maintain silence until his superior sent someone he trusted, a man with a scar and mismatched eyes. Abigail's gaze returned to the window, where the search activity had intensified. We need to help him. We will, but not by rushing headlong into their trap. Phillips removed his clerical collar, replacing it with a worn bandana. From a closet, he retrieved a battered shotgun that seemed incongruous in the hands of a man of God. Your disguise remains effective. They're searching for a bounty hunter and an escaped prisoner, not a Comanche youth and an elderly minister. What about my children? The weight of maternal anxiety threatened to overwhelm Abigail's fragile composure. If Hargrove knows about Nate, he might suspect I've returned for them. Unlikely. Hargrove's concern is the evidence, not your family. Phillips checked the shotgun's loads with practiced ease that suggested a life before his ministry. Wilcox wants your children for their inheritance. That much hasn't changed. The Reverend outlined a new plan, adapted to their altered circumstances. Rather than meeting at the schoolhouse, they would use the church's root cellar, connected via an old tunnel to the stables as their rallying point. Phillips would gather information in town while Abigail remained hidden. Then they would move after dark to free Nate and proceed to Wilcox's ranch for the children. The tunnel was dug during the early settlement days, Phillips explained, lifting a trapdoor concealed beneath a faded rug. Indian raids were common then, and the church served as a refuge. Most have forgotten its existence. Abigail descended worn wooden steps into cool darkness, the Reverend following with a small lantern that cast long shadows across the earthen walls. The root cellar itself was modest but well stocked with preserved foods and emergency supplies. At its far end, partially concealed behind stacked barrels, a narrow archway led to the tunnel. Rest here, Phillips advised, setting the lantern on a rough-hewn table. I'll return with news when I can. If I haven't appeared by sundown, use the tunnel to reach the stables and proceed alone to Wilcox's ranch. After the Reverend departed, securing the trapdoor behind him, Abigail sank onto a wooden bench, the events of the morning catching up with her. The physical strain of maintaining her disguise, the emotional toll of being so close yet still separated from her children, and now the fear for Nate's safety, all combined into a crushing weight. She examined Cooper's evidence packet without opening it, respecting the seal that might later prove its authenticity in court. The knowledge it contained had already cost at least 2 lives, James and Cooper himself, and put countless others at risk, including Nate, whose fate remained unknown. Hours passed in tense solitude, marked only by the distant tolling of the church bell and the muffled sounds of activity above. Abigail used the time to inspect and clean Hannah's necklace, the simple task helping to focus her turbulent thoughts. The silver pendant depicted a thunderbird, its wings outstretched in protection, a fitting symbol for their current circumstances. Late afternoon brought the creak of the trapdoor opening. Reverend Phillips descended, his expression grim but determined. He carried a bundle of clothing and a small basket of food. "Your friend lives," he announced without preamble, though not without injury. "They're holding him in the reinforced cell, the same one you occupied. Hargrove has sent for additional troops from Fort Laramie." Relief at Nate's survival mingled with concern for his condition. How badly? A beating, primarily. Jenkins' men aren't subtle in their methods. Phillips unpacked the basket, revealing bread, cheese, and a flask of water. They discovered his true identity when a telegram arrived from Fort Defiance, warning of his investigation. Someone there betrayed him, or was coerced into talking, Abigail suggested, thinking of the far-reaching influence men like Hargrove wielded. What's their plan for him? Officially, he'll be transferred to military custody tomorrow when the additional troops arrive. Unofficially, Phillips left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Nate would never reach fort. Laramie alive, and my children still at Wilcox's ranch, but there's been a development. The Reverend hesitated. Martha Wilcox brought them into town this afternoon to the doctor's house. The baby has worsened, fever, refusing all nourishment. Dr. Wilson believes it's milk fever. Maternal terror surged through Abigail. Milk fever could kill an infant within days, if untreated. I need to go to him. Now. That's what they're expecting, Phillips cautioned. The timing is suspicious, Abigail. Your baby falls ill just as Hargrove arrives, and your rescuer is captured. The doctor's house is under observation by at least 3 of Wilcox's men. But maternal instinct outweighed caution. If Thomas is truly ill, every hour matters. I won't sacrifice my son to preserve our plan. Phillips studied her, then nodded slowly. There may be a way to reach the doctor's house undetected. Dr. Wilson's wife is one of my parishioners, devoted but physically frail. I often visit in the evenings to pray with her. They wouldn't suspect a minister making a pastoral call, Abigail realized, hoping to rekindle, and his young Comanche convert accompanied him to learn Christian charity. Phillips smiled thinly. It's a risk, but a calculated one. They refined the approach as daylight faded. The Reverend would create a diversion near the jail, drawing attention away from the doctor's house long enough for Abigail to slip inside. Once there, her priority would be Thomas, with Mary and Nate as secondary objectives if opportunity allowed. The evidence, Abigail asked as they prepared to leave, glancing at the oilskin packet. Remains here, Phillips decided. Too valuable to risk if we're captured. If neither of us returns by midnight, Rebecca Holloway knows to retrieve it and take it to the territorial judge in Laramie. As darkness settled over Redemption Creek, they emerged from the church's side door. Phillips now dressed in his clerical garb, Bible in hand. Abigail still in her Comanche disguise, but with a small wooden cross suspended alongside Hannah's pendant, the symbol of a recent convert that would explain her presence with the minister. The town had transformed since morning, an undercurrent of tension visible in the increased patrols and the lanterns burning in windows, normally dark after sundown. They walked openly down the main street, Phillips nodding respectfully to the armed men they passed. None challenged them directly, though. Several eyed Abigail with curiosity. "Reverend," a voice called as they approached the doctor's residence. Frank Miller emerged from the shadows beside the picket fence, rifle cradled in his arms. "Kind of late for house calls, isn't it? Mrs. Wilson's consumption troubles her more at night," Phillips replied evenly. "She finds comfort in evening. In prayers. Mr. Wilcox knows of my regular visits." Miller's gaze shifted to Abigail, suspicion evident. "Still dragging that Indian boy around, I see." "Joseph is learning our ways," Phillips said, using the Christian name they'd agreed upon for Abigail's persona. "Dr. Wilson has expressed interest in medical missionary work among the Comanche. I thought the experience would be educational for the boy." The explanation seemed to satisfy Miller, or at least didn't raise sufficient suspicion to warrant interference. He stepped aside, allowing them to proceed to the doctor's front door. Dr. Wilson himself answered their knock, his normally composed features strained with fatigue. Recognition flickered in his eyes at the sight of Abigail, quickly masked by professional discretion. "Reverend Phillips," he greeted with convincing weariness, "Mrs. Wilson is resting, but she'll be glad of your visit. Please come in." The doctor's house smelled of camphor and carbolic acid, the familiar medicinal scents overlaid with something sweeter, the distinctive odor of milk fever in an infant. Abigail's heart clenched at the implication. Thomas was truly ill, not just a pawn in Wilcox's machinations. Martha Wilcox brought in a sick infant earlier, Dr. Wilson remarked, leading them into his examination room rather than the parlor. I'd welcome your young friend's assistance if you're amenable. The Comanche have remedies for childhood fevers that sometimes prove effective when our medicines fail. The coded message was clear. Wilson was providing cover for Abigail to see her child. Phillips nodded agreement, then followed the doctor's gesture toward the parlor, ostensibly to visit with Mrs. Wilson while leaving Joseph to assist with the medical situation. Once alone with Abigail, Wilson dropped all pretense. "Your son is through there," he whispered, indicating a door leading to a back bedroom. "Martha Wilcox is with him, and your daughter is sleeping in the chair beside the bed. I gave Martha a mild sedative in her tea. She'll be drowsy but not unconscious." "How bad is he?" Abigail asked, maternal fear overriding all other concerns. "Bad enough," Wilson admitted grimly. "Without his mother's milk, the substitutes have caused inflammation. His fever's high, but I've seen worse cases recover." He pressed a small vial into her hand. "Laudanum. 4 drops in Martha's tea will render her unconscious within minutes. The window above the herb garden is unlatched." Abigail gripped the doctor's arm in silent gratitude, then moved silently toward the bedroom door. She eased it open, heart hammering against her ribs with painful intensity. The scene inside struck her with physical force. Thomas, tiny and flushed with fever in the center of a large bed. Mary curled in an armchair, copper hair tumbled across, her face in sleep. Martha Wilcox beside the bed, her back to the door as she wrung out a cloth in a basin of water. "Doctor?" Martha asked without turning. "Has the fever reduced at all?" Abigail remained silent, closing the door softly behind her. The slight click caused Martha to turn, confusion crossing her features at the sight of a young Comanche, rather. Then the doctor. "Who?" she began, rising in alarm. "Hello, Martha," Abigail said softly, the first English word she'd spoken aloud since entering town. She reached up, unwinding the cloth that partially concealed her features. "It's been a while." Recognition dawned in the other woman's eyes, followed immediately by fear. "Abigail, but you're a concerned mother," Abigail finished, moving toward the bed, "one whose children were taken from her by force." Martha's hand moved toward a small bell on the bedside table, a movement Abigail had anticipated. In one fluid motion, she caught the older woman's wrist, applying gentle but firm pressure to the nerve point Nate had taught her. "Don't," she advised quietly. "I have no quarrel with you, Martha. You've cared for my children when I couldn't, but they're coming with me now." "Hank will kill you," Martha whispered, real fear in her eyes. "He has men everywhere, the colonel too. They've been waiting for you to return." "I know." Abigail released Martha's wrist, indicating a teacup on the side table. "Drink your tea, Martha. What happens next will be easier if you're asleep." Understanding flickered in the older woman's eyes. "You're going to drug me." "I'd prefer not to force you," Abigail admitted, uncorking the laudanum vial. "But I will if necessary. My son needs me." To her surprise, Martha made no further protest as she added the drops to the tea. "4 is excessive," the older woman remarked with unexpected pragmatism. "2 would suffice. I'm not as young as I once was." Abigail hesitated, then poured out half the dose. Martha accepted the cup with dignity, sipping it slowly, while Abigail moved to examine Thomas. Her baby's condition confirmed the doctor's assessment: feverish, dehydrated, his tiny body fighting the inflammation caused by unsuitable milk. Maternal instinct overwhelmed her, tears threatening as she lifted him gently from the bed. "He cries for you." Martha said softly, the sedative already affecting her speech. Every night. Mary too, though she's stronger, braver. A sad smile crossed her features. She reminds me of my Julia, the one I lost in '62. The unexpected confession caught Abigail off guard. I didn't know you'd lost a child. Cholera, she was 5. Martha's eyes grew heavy, the laudanum taking effect. Hank never speaks of her, says remembering makes me weak. She reached out, touching Thomas's flushed cheek with gentle fingers. I didn't want your children, Abigail. That was Hank's doing, but I've tried to care for them properly. I believe you, Abigail said, surprised to find she meant it. Martha Wilcox, for all her complicity in her husband's schemes, had shown genuine concern for Thomas and Mary. Help me now. Tell me how many men are watching the house. 3 outside, Miller by the gate, 2 others at the back. Martha's words slurred slightly, her struggle against the sedative evident. Hank's at the jail with the colonel. They're questioning your friend, the Indian marshal. Abigail moved to wake Mary, her heart constricting at the sight of her daughter's peaceful face. 4 years old, and already she'd endured more loss than many adults. Her father's death, separation from her mother, and now this upheaval. She brushed the copper curls from Mary's forehead, whispering her name softly. The little girl stirred, blue eyes blinking open in confusion. Recognition dawned slowly, disbelief giving way to wonder. "Mama," she whispered, reaching up to touch Abigail's darkened face. "Is it really you?" "Yes, sweetheart." Abigail gathered her daughter close with her free arm, Thomas cradled securely against her chest. "I'm here now." Mary buried her face against Abigail's neck, small body trembling with emotion. "They said you were gone forever, that you did something bad." "That wasn't true," Abigail assured her, heart breaking at her daughter's distress. "I would never leave you willingly, never." From the outer room came the sound of the front door opening, followed by raised voices, Phillips and Dr. Wilson, their tones deliberately loud, creating the diversion they'd planned. Martha struggled to rise from her chair, the laudanum making, her movements clumsy. "Go," she murmured, gesturing weakly toward the window. "They'll check here soon." Abigail hesitated, unexpectedly torn. Despite everything, Martha had shown a grandmother's care to her children. "Come with us," she found herself offering. "Hank doesn't deserve your loyalty." A sad smile crossed Martha's increasingly drowsy features. 30 years of marriage leaves little room for rebellion, Abigail. Besides, where would an old woman like me go? She waved toward the window again. "Save your children. And that marshal of yours, if you can. He's a good man, refused to break even when they hurt him badly." The knowledge that Nate had endured torture without betraying their plan strengthened Abigail's resolve. She moved quickly to the window, easing it open with one hand while balancing Thomas against her shoulder. The baby whimpered softly, his fever-warm body radiating heat against her neck. "Hold tight to my neck, Mary," she instructed, helping her daughter climb onto her back. "Like a little monkey, remember? Don't let go until I tell you." With both children secured, Abigail eased through the window into the herb garden below. The night air carried a hint of impending rain, the clouds obscuring the moon and stars. A blessing that deepened the shadows, concealing their escape. She crouched beneath the window, listening intently for any sign of Wilcox's men. Footsteps crunched on gravel, one of the guards making his rounds. Abigail pressed herself against the house wall, Mary's arms tightening around her neck in silent understanding of the danger. The steps passed, moving toward the front of the house where the diversion continued. "Now," Abigail whispered, darting low across the garden toward the rear fence. The weathered boards had a loose section. She'd spotted it from the bedroom window, calculating it would be just large enough for them to squeeze through. They reached the fence without detection, but as Abigail worked to move the loose board, Thomas began to cry, a thin, feverish wail that pierced the night. Mary instinctively covered her brother's mouth with a small hand, but the damage was done. "Someone's in the garden," a male voice called from near the house. Lantern light spilled across the yard as the guards converged on their position. Abigail abandoned stealth for speed, wrenching the board aside and pushing Mary through the gap. "Run to the church," she commanded, passing Thomas through next before following herself. They emerged into the narrow alley behind the row of houses, darkness providing momentary cover as shouts erupted behind them. Abigail swept Mary into her arms alongside Thomas, her body fueled by maternal desperation as she ran toward the distant shape of the church steeple. Gunshots echoed from the direction of the jail, not warning shots this time, but the distinctive, a pattern of an exchange of fire. The diversion had escalated beyond Phillips's control, the town erupting into open conflict. Lanterns flared to life along Main Street as townspeople emerged to investigate the commotion. Abigail darted between buildings, keeping to shadows while working her way toward the church. Thomas's cries had subsided to whimpers, his small body burning against her chest. Mary remained silent, her face buried against her mother's shoulder in perfect understanding of the danger. They were halfway to safety when disaster struck. Rounding the corner of the Mercantile, Abigail collided with a solid figure, Colonel Edward Hargrove himself, accompanied by 2 soldiers. "What the—" he began, then his eyes widened in recognition. Despite her disguise, "Mrs. Monroe, what an unexpected pleasure." Abigail backed away, clutching her children tighter, but the soldiers moved to block her retreat. Hargrove smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "I've been looking forward to meeting James's widow," he said conversationally, as if they'd encountered each other at a social gathering rather than a nighttime escape. "He spoke of you often, quite the devoted husband by all accounts." "You murdered him," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Shot in the back on your orders." Hargrove's smile didn't falter. "A regrettable necessity. James was an excellent officer but lacked discretion, rather like your friend Rivers." He gestured toward the jail, where the gunfire had intensified. "That unfortunate commotion is what remains of his rescue attempt. The Reverend's involvement was unexpected, I admit." Horror washed through Abigail at the implication. Phillips had been captured, or worse. And Nate was still fighting, outnumbered and injured, while she stood helpless with her children before the architect of their suffering. "What do you want?" she demanded, though she knew the answer. Cooper's evidence, of course. Hargrove's pleasant demeanor hardened. "The documents he stole before his untimely demise. I know Rivers came to retrieve them, and I know you've been helping him. Tell me where they are, Mrs. Monroe, and your children might yet grow up with a mother." Behind Hargrove, a shadow detached. From the darkness between buildings, a familiar form moving with silent grace despite obvious injury. Nate, his face bloodied, but his mismatched eyes burning with cold determination. He placed a finger to his lips in silent warning, then raised his revolver toward the colonel's back. Abigail met his gaze over Hargrove's shoulder, understanding flowing between them without words. She had one chance to distract the colonel and his men. "The evidence is in the church," she said clearly, drawing Hargrove's full attention. "Hidden beneath the altar, where Cooper prayed the night before his death." Hargrove's expression shifted to triumph. "Excellent. Lieutenant, escort Mrs. Monroe and her offspring to—" The rest of his order was lost in the thunder of Nate's revolver. The colonel staggered forward, a look of profound surprise crossing his features as crimson blossomed across his immaculate uniform jacket. Chaos erupted in the narrow street. The lieutenant and sergeant drew their weapons, but Nate was already moving, his injured body somehow maintaining the fluid grace that had impressed Abigail from their first meeting. He tackled the lieutenant while kicking the sergeant's legs. From beneath him, both soldiers crashed to the ground, one losing his pistol in the impact. "Run!" Nate commanded, grappling with the lieutenant who outweighed him by at least 30 pounds. Abigail didn't hesitate. Clutching her children tightly, she darted past the struggling men toward the church that now seemed impossibly distant. Behind her, more shouts rose as Wilcox's men converged on the commotion, drawn by the gunshot that had felled their military ally. Mary clung tightly to her neck, small face buried against her shoulder, while Thomas whimpered weakly, his fever ravaged, body radiating alarming heat. Abigail's lungs burned with the exertion of carrying 2 children at a run, but maternal desperation lent her strength she hadn't known she possessed. She reached the church's side entrance and found it locked. Shifting the children's weight, she pounded desperately on the weathered wood with her free hand. No response came from within. If Phillips had been captured or killed in the diversion, there would be no help from that quarter. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. Abigail abandoned the door and darted toward the rear of the building, where the kitchen garden offered the possibility of concealment. As she rounded the corner, a figure materialized from the shadows. Rebecca Holloway, her round face tense with urgency. "This way!" the midwife hissed, gesturing toward the small shed where gardening tools were stored. Quickly, Abigail followed without question, ducking into the cramped space as Rebecca secured the door behind them. In the darkness, Rebecca's hands found the rough earthen floor, lifting a concealed trapdoor that revealed a set of steep stairs. "The root cellar connects to the Reverend's study," she explained, helping Abigail maneuver down the narrow opening with her children. "He told me to watch for you if things went wrong. Phillips, is he alive but wounded? Jenkins shot him when he tried to create a diversion at the jail." Rebecca followed them down, securing the trapdoor above. A small lantern illuminated the familiar space Abigail had hidden in earlier. "Your friend Rivers escaped during the confusion." Relief mingled with renewed anxiety. Nate had escaped only to risk himself again to save her and the children. And now he was once more in desperate combat, outnumbered and injured. "The evidence packet," Abigail said urgently. "Where is it?" Rebecca moved to the stack of barrels in the corner, retrieving the oilskin package from its hiding place. "Here. Phillips said if he didn't return, I was to take it to Judge Carlton in Laramie." Change of plans, Abigail decided, her mind racing through their dwindling options. "We need to get my children to safety first. Thomas is burning with fever. He needs proper care immediately." Rebecca examined the infant with professional concern, her experienced hands gentle on his flushed skin. "Milk fever, advanced stage. We need to break it within hours or—" She left the dire consequence unstated. "Can you treat him here?" Abigail asked, desperation evident in her voice. "I need herbs from my cottage, milk thistle, feverfew." The midwife glanced toward the ceiling, where the sounds of men searching the church grounds filtered through. "But that's impossible now. They'll have my place too." Mary, who had remained preternaturally silent throughout their flight, spoke up in a small, determined voice. "Is Mama in trouble?" Abigail knelt, bringing herself to eye level with her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. Bad men are trying to hurt us, but we're going to be brave, just like your father would want." The mention of James brought fresh resolve to Abigail's exhausted mind. Her husband had died investigating this conspiracy. She would not let his sacrifice, or Cooper's or potentially Nate's, be in vain. "The tunnel," she said, turning to Rebecca. "Where does it lead exactly?" "The livery stable," Rebecca replied. "It emerges in an old storage room that's rarely used." "And the stable backs onto the east road, the one leading to Fort Defiance." Abigail's thoughts crystallized into a desperate plan. "Is there a horse we could take? Something that won't be immediately missed?" Rebecca considered this. "Old Jim keeps his personal mare in the back stall. He'd help if he knew the circumstances. He's No friend to Wilcox, the decision formed with sudden clarity. They would use the tunnel to reach the livery, secure the horse, and make for Fort Defiance, where Nate had mentioned allies who could be trusted. The evidence would travel with them, ensuring that even if Nate fell in his delaying action, justice would eventually prevail. "We need to move now," Abigail decided, gathering Thomas close. "The longer we delay, the more men Wilcox will have searching for us." Rebecca nodded, gathering the few supplies available in the root cellar, a canteen of water, some dried apples, a small knife that might serve as both tool and weapon if necessary. She led them toward the tunnel entrance, lanterns held high, to illuminate the narrow passage. "Stay close," the midwife advised, ducking into the earthen corridor. "There are support beams every few yards. Watch your head." The tunnel stretched before them, a testament to the foresight of early settlers who had built escape routes into the very foundations of their community. Abigail followed Rebecca's bobbing lantern, one arm cradling Thomas against her chest, the other guiding Mary along the uneven floor. The evidence packet was secured inside her shirt, pressed against her skin where it wouldn't be lost in their flight. They moved as quickly as the cramped conditions allowed, the sounds from above fading as they progressed beneath the street that separated the church from the livery stable. Mary kept pace without complaint, her small face set in an expression of determination that reminded Abigail painfully of James. "Almost there," Rebecca whispered, after several minutes of hurried progress. "The exit ladder can be tricky. It hasn't been used in years." As they approached the tunnel's end, a new sound penetrated the earthen walls, gunfire, more distant than before but sustained in its intensity. Nate was still fighting, still drawing attention away from their escape route. Abigail's heart constricted with fear for him, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate task. Rebecca reached the ladder first, testing the ancient rungs before beginning her ascent. The trapdoor above resisted initially, years of disuse, causing the wood to swell and stick in its frame. With a final heave, the midwife forced it open, emerging into the dusty storage room of the livery stable. Abigail passed Thomas up first, then helped Mary onto the ladder. The little girl climbed, with surprising agility, her small boots finding purchase on each worn rung. Abigail followed last, the oilskin packet secure against her chest, her muscles protesting the climb after the strain of their desperate flight. The storage room was exactly as Rebecca had described, small, dusty, and apparently forgotten by. The stable's current occupants, tack from a bygone era hung on the walls, saddles designed for cavalry mounts rather than civilian horses, bridles that had perhaps seen service in the Mexican War decades earlier. Rebecca cracked the door, peering cautiously into the main stable. "3 men at the front watching the street," she reported. "Old Jim is nowhere to be seen, probably hiding from the trouble." "And the back stalls?" "Clear from what I can see. The mare should be in the last one on the left." They slipped from the storage room into the shadowy main stable, moving silently past empty stalls toward their destination. Most of the town's horses had been requisitioned for the search, leaving the building eerily vacant, except for a few animals too old or unsuitable for hard riding. Old Jim's mare proved to be a sturdy bay, not young but well cared for, with intelligent eyes that regarded their approach with cautious interest. Abigail stroked her velvety nose, murmuring soothing words as Rebecca quickly located a saddle and bridle from the nearby tack room. "She'll carry all 3 of you," Rebecca whispered, expertly saddling the animal. "Not at a gallop, but she'll maintain a steady pace through the night." Abigail's heart sank as she realized the midwife wasn't planning to accompany them. "You should come with us," she urged. "When they discover your involvement—" Rebecca shook her head firmly. "I was born in Redemption Creek, Abigail. My mother delivered half the town's children, and I delivered the other half. They may suspect me, but they won't harm one of their own." Her expression hardened. Besides, someone needs to help Reverend Phillips and your martial friend if he survives this night. The pragmatic assessment silenced Abigail's objections. Rebecca was right. Her established position in the community offered protection that an outsider like Abigail could never claim. And if Nate survived, he would need allies within the town. Fort Defiance, Abigail confirmed, as Rebecca adjusted the stirrups to accommodate her shorter legs. Ask for Jacob Greyhorse's brother. He'll help you if you mention Nate's name. Take the East Trail until dawn, Rebecca instructed, helping Abigail mount with both children. Then cut north through Willis Canyon. It's longer but less traveled. You'll reach the fort in 2 days if you pace the mare properly. Thomas settled against Abigail's chest in a sling Rebecca fashioned from a stable blanket, while Mary sat securely behind her, small arms wrapped tightly around her mother's waist. The arrangement was awkward, but functional. The mare would be able to carry them at a steady walk, perhaps an occasional trot when the terrain allowed. The back door leads to the alley, Rebecca said, taking the reins to guide them through the dimly lit stable. From there, you can reach the East Road without crossing Main Street. Wait for my signal. I'll create a distraction at the front to draw the guards' attention. Abigail reached down, clasping the midwife's hand in silent gratitude. Words seemed inadequate for the courage Rebecca had shown, risking everything to help a woman many in the town had already condemned. When this is over, Abigail promised, the truth will be known about everything. Rebecca smiled sadly. Just get those children to safety and make sure Cooper's evidence reaches the right hands. That's all the justice I need. With a final squeeze of Abigail's hand, the midwife moved toward the front of the stable. Moments later, her voice rang out in convincing panic. Fire! The hayloft is burning! Help! Quickly! The guards responded immediately, boots pounding on packed earth as they rushed to investigate the non-existent blaze. Abigail seized the opportunity, urging the mare through the back door and into the alley beyond. The animal moved with surprising quietness, hooves muffled by the loose soil of the rarely used passage. They reached the East Road without encounter, the sounds of commotion from town fading behind them as Abigail guided the mare into a steady walk. The overcast sky had begun to clear, stars emerging to illuminate their path across the open prairie that stretched toward distant hills. Mary's arms tightened around her waist. Are the bad men gone, Mama? We're getting away from them, Abigail assured her, reaching back to pat her daughter's knee. And we're going to a safe place where you and Thomas can get better. What about the man with the different-colored eyes? Mary asked, her perceptiveness surprising Abigail. Is he coming too? The question pierced Abigail's heart. She had no answer that wouldn't be either a lie or a painful truth too heavy for a child's shoulders. He's helping other people right now, she said finally. But he knows where we're going. As they rode steadily eastward, Abigail's thoughts remained with Nate. His last desperate stand had purchased their escape, but at what cost? She remembered his quiet strength, the unexpected gentleness beneath his warrior's exterior, the way he'd respected her intelligence and courage rather than dismissing them as James's colleagues often had. Thomas stirred against her chest, his fever still burning, but his breathing steadier than before. The night air seemed to soothe him somewhat, cool and clean after the closeness of the town. Abigail adjusted his blanket, ensuring he was protected from the breeze without overheating. An hour passed, then another. The mare maintained her steady pace, apparently content with her burden despite the unusual arrangement. Abigail kept vigilant watch for pursuers, but the road behind them remained empty. Either the confusion in town continued to occupy Wilcox's men, or they were searching in the wrong direction. Dawn found them approaching the entrance to Willis Canyon, just as Rebecca had directed. Abigail reined in beside a small stream, allowing the mare to drink while she tended to the children. Mary had fallen asleep against her back, exhaustion finally overcoming the little girl's remarkable endurance. Thomas's fever seemed marginally lower, his tiny features more relaxed than they had been in town. As Abigail dampened a cloth to wipe her son's flushed face, the distant thunder of hoofbeats reached her ears. Her heart lurched painfully, fear surging anew as she scanned the horizon behind them. A lone rider approached at speed, silhouetted against the rising sun. Abigail tensed, preparing to mount and flee, when something about the rider's posture struck her as familiar. The straight back, the fluid movement with the horse rather than against it. The figure drew closer, and hope blossomed as Abigail recognized the distinctive buckskin horse. Nate Rivers, somehow alive despite impossible odds, was galloping toward them. She waited, hardly daring to believe the evidence of her own eyes, until he reined in beside them, his face bloodied, clothing torn, but his mismatched eyes burning. With the same quiet intensity she remembered. "Hargrove?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "Dead," Nate confirmed, dismounting stiffly. "Along with Jenkins and 2 of Wilcox's men. The lieutenant and sergeant are under citizen's arrest. Parker and some of the townsfolk finally found their courage when the truth started emerging." "And Wilcox?" A grim smile crossed Nate's battered features. "Fled toward the territorial border. With whatever cash he could grab. He won't get far. I sent telegrams to every marshal's office within 100 miles before I left town." Relief weakened Abigail's knees, tears threatening for the first time since their desperate escape began. "Phillips?" "Wounded but recovering. Rebecca's caring for him." Nate approached cautiously, as if uncertain of his welcome now that the immediate danger had passed. "The evidence?" Abigail patted her shirt where the oilskin packet remained secure. "Safe. We were taking it to Fort Defiance." "A good plan," he acknowledged, "but unnecessary now." Judge Carlton arrived with the morning stage. Apparently someone named Martha Wilcox sent him an urgent message 2 days ago detailing her husband's crimes. The revelation stunned Abigail. Martha, despite her outward compliance with her husband's schemes, had secretly worked to bring him to justice. The laudanum-induced confession took on new meaning, not merely an old woman's regrets, but the explanation of someone who had already taken action against a lifetime of wrongs. "What happens now?" Abigail asked, suddenly uncertain. The immediate. Threats had been neutralized, but the future remained uncharted territory. Nate glanced at Thomas, professional assessment evident in his gaze. "First, we get your son to Fort Defiance. There's a Comanche healer there who knows more about milk fever than any army doctor. Then—" He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across his usually stoic features. "After that depends on what you want, Abigail." The statement hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Abigail studied him in the clear morning light. This complicated man, who had risked everything to save a woman he barely knew, honoring a debt to her dead husband, but perhaps finding something more valuable in the process. Mary stirred against Abigail's back, blue eyes blinking open to find Nate standing before them. A smile of recognition lit her small face. "You came back," she said, with a child's simple certainty. "Mama said you would." Something in Nate's expression softened as he regarded the little girl. "Your mama's a wise woman," he replied, offering Mary a gentle smile that transformed his scarred features. "I keep my promises." The moment stretched between them, fragile but filled with possibility. Abigail thought of James, his death now avenged, his mission completed through their combined efforts. She thought of the jail cell, where she'd expected to die, and the miraculous intervention that had instead opened doors to an unimagined future. "We should move," Nate said finally, mounting his buckskin. "Thomas needs treatment, and we've still got a day's ride ahead." Abigail nodded, settling more comfortably in the saddle with her precious burdens. As they rode side by side into the canyon, the rising sun at their backs, she found herself contemplating not just the immediate journey to Fort Defiance, but the longer path that might lie beyond. Justice had been served, at great cost, but with final victory. What remained was the chance to build something new from the ashes of conspiracy and corruption, not just for the territory, but perhaps for themselves as well. Thomas sighed in his feverish sleep, his small body finally beginning to cool as the healing process took hold. Mary's arms remained secure around Abigail's waist, her daughter's resilience a constant wonder. And beside them rode Nate Rivers, Half-Comanche former marshal, a man who had found his own path between conflicting worlds. As they traveled deeper into Willis Canyon, leaving Redemption Creek and its ghosts behind, Abigail realized that the name of the town had finally become meaningful, though not in the way its founders intended. Redemption had indeed come to that small frontier community, through truth, through justice, and through the courage of those who refused to surrender to corruption. The future stretched before them, as vast and promising as the western sky above. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.